Hello, everybody. Lovely to be back. And we're very fortunate today that we're here with Bill Abrams from Trickle Up, who was just telling me he will be celebrating in a short amount of time his 14-year anniversary at Trickle Up. And I have a soft spot in my heart for Trickle Up because I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Costa Rica, and Trickle Up gave me and my community, our co-op we were starting, our funds to get started with. So I have a special feeling for Trickle Up, and I'm so glad, Bill, that you could be here.
I love that fact. That's a great story, and it says something about Trickle Up, which has been around for 40 years now, and in the early days indeed did start with Peace Corps workers who were working with people on the ground in different countries to get Trickle Up going. And a number of times I've met people who said, yes, I was in the Peace Corps in Malawi or Costa Rica or Burundi or wherever. So it has this kind of amazing historical presence, and now we'll add you to the list. So thank you for inviting me, and glad we share Trickle Up in our bloodstream.
Yes, from when I was very young. So just to start with, Bill, can you just give us a few, just like the highlights of how you got to Trickle Up, because you didn't start out in this sector.
Right. So before Trickle Up, I spent about 30 years working in the media business. Originally, I was a reporter and editor for the Wall Street Journal. Then I went to ABC Television and ABC News in a couple of different roles, and then to the New York Times. Back when I was 13 years old, my mother recognized I had no particular athletic ability, and my two older brothers were quite good. And so she steered me away from harm's way and said, why don't you go get on the school newspaper? So that shaped about, 35 or 40 years of my life. And then I had the opportunity to think about what I wanted to do next in my career, with my life. And it's a longer story, but I found my way to Trickle Up, which was a very lucky day for me.
And that I'm curious about what, having that background, what that perspective gives you that others who don't have that journalist newspaper background might, and what's that, I don't know, what is that, a different perspective than others would have?
Well, obviously there are the kind of communication skills that one develops in journalism that are very relevant to what you do. Running and advocating for a nonprofit. But the thing that always struck me is sort of what is the most common similarity between working at Trickle Up, working at the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or ABC News is they're all mission-driven organizations. Journalism, people are there because they believe in something, and they're trying to use journalism, at least the good ones, at least in those days, to make change, to inform people, to make some difference in the world. And that is also certainly the core purpose of Trickle Up and all other nonprofits. So that sense of mission is terribly important in terms of almost everything else. How you attract people, how you motivate people, how you decide what, as an organization, you choose to do and what you choose not to do. So I think mission congruence is the number one similarity, or thing that I brought from my media career to this.
And when you switched to this where you are now, what are the things about being a leader or manager that you found different, that you had to adjust to?
What's different? Peter Drucker, the great management theorist and guru, who wrote a lot about nonprofits, and he had a very interesting observation that I read when I was making my transition and trying to learn more about how nonprofits, what makes them tick. And he said, mission. People who go to work in nonprofits generally earn less than they would in the private sector. So that gives them extra currency at the decision-making table, and nonprofits have to be more consensus-driven than top-down. And I believe that's true, although I think even now in the corporate world, things are much more consensus-driven, and the old hierarchical command and control models don't really work in the corporate world either.
So is that something that you yourself had to adjust to, being more consensus driven? I have heard that for people, especially that come like from the military. That's, yeah.
And I'm still learning.
Yeah.
And we'll always be learning, but it's about listening. It's about taking in other points of view. It's about how one reaches decisions. At the end of the day, decisions have to be made. You rarely have unanimity. And what's important is that people both need to be heard, and you will have a better decision with more inputs and a bit more debate and reflections. As a result, sometimes decision making in nonprofits moves a little slower and a little more cumbersome or more complicated than it might be in a classic command and control environment, but I believe you get a better result.
And that's the thing that people talk about a lot in NGOs, like how do we are consensus driven, but how do we still get to decisions? When do we say that's enough and now we're going to decide? So how do you balance those things out?
Um, I balance them as carefully as I can.
That's a good answer.
Because good, inclusive, participatory decision making, it takes time. In our case, we have a headquarters team here in New York, and then we have teams in 3 offices, one in India, one in Guatemala, and one in Burkina Faso. So there's matters of differences of time zones and language. So you have to work harder to kind of take it all in. And it's very important to listen to the people who are the closest to the work, who are our teams in the field. Now, the people we have here in New York and headquarters are very experienced and very smart, but they're not out there every day in the front lines of Burkina Faso or Guatemala. So not all opinions matter, but not all opinions matter equally. Mm-hmm. And so you got to kind of think about and make some choices about weighting, valuing different inputs and kind of what the weight in the sense of the value is, not the time. So we're, and the other piece that's important is having clarity about roles and responsibilities in decision making. What's a headquarters decision? What's a field decision? What's a decision by the president or the senior management team compared to a decision by a department head? And every organization struggles with that. And sometimes you can draw some bright lines. Decisions over X amount of dollars have to go to this level. In my experience, rarely are they that neat and clean. So a lot of it is you have to have some general guidelines, and then you have to have sort of a good intuition and a good comfort and collaboration between decision makers, so that you can also have the space to improvise or adapt.
So what do you do on a day-to-day level? Like when where do you like to know that you need to be spending your time?
Yeah, that's a good question. Time management is the great challenge for me and most leaders, right? And I think it's especially true in a smaller nonprofit. Trickle Up has a budget of about $8 million. We have a staff of about 70 people. So you have to do more. You have to be more of a multitasker. Inevitably, you get involved perhaps in more granular decisions than a counterpart at a large organization might. I try to prioritize around the areas where I bring the greatest value to the organization. Mm. And so in my particular case, I did not grow up in the international development sector. I have learned a lot about it over 14 years. But my vice president of programs, the people on our program staff, are far and away more expert and experienced. So I try to the greatest extent possible to give them space. We consult, we talk a lot, but I like to say that I've only really made 3 important decisions in the program area here in 14 years, which was we have now our 3rd vice president of programs. And that's really my job, is picking the leadership and then supporting leadership. And so a lot of my work is, of course, around fundraising, as is the case with most CEOs. So today, for example, I had a meeting with our largest corporate funder, just kind of checking in, casual cup of coffee. Just finished a meeting with our head of vice president of development, working on a capital campaign case statement. This afternoon, I'm involved in discussions of a couple of nonprofits who are trying to work together on a fundraising effort. So a great deal of my time is spent around fundraising in one form or another. And also a big chunk of time is working with the board, which is everything from maintaining relationships, planning board meetings. We had a board meeting yesterday, so inevitably I spend half or more of the day after doing kind of follow-up check-in calls with the board chair. How do you think the meeting went with the senior management team? Trying to process everything that was said. And then the other piece of it is really leadership in general of the organization, and how how do you set a tone? How do you set a high-level direction? We've just finished a 3-year strategic plan, so that was a very important part of my work. And I was delighted to read this morning that Jim Collins, the author of Good to Great, who I adore, has a new book called The Flywheel Effect, which I immediately ordered, and I'm listening to his podcast. So trying to think at a high level about leadership and management and how organizations evolve and how they grow and how they sustain themselves and how they scale. So trying to find time in the day to think about the high level, longer range thoughts. Some people have said that the job of the CEO is to think about the future. So I try to spend part of every day thinking about the future.
I think that's where my question was, because when we were talking about the decision making and who should make the decisions, and all of this takes time to think about it. Like, what do I think? What do we know is the best way the organization needs to be run? What do we know from others or from my own experience? And a lot of people have a hard time finding the time, right? To do what you're saying, to take the time to learn and read and reflect. It's hard to carve that time out, no matter what the size of your organization.
It's very hard. Every CEO I've ever known,
right?
I never have the time to sit back, reflect, think, read, and that's true. And that's sort of the reality. I remember reading a piece in the Harvard Business Review that said, get over that fantasy that you're going to be able to climb up into the ivory tower and think about the long-term future.
Right, having big thoughts.
Because every day you come in and you spend a great deal of your time firefighting and doing the day in and day out business, whether it's fundraising or whatever. And in some ways, that is one of the values of having a formal strategic planning process, which I have very mixed feelings about, but it does give you a structure or a process. It forces you to step back, think about the future. It forces you, if you do it well, to bring in all those voices and all those perspectives, so that you can chart a course for the next several years and try to guide the organization that way.
And do you have a formal way that you carve out time every day? Do you block it on your calendar or?
No, I do. I read a lot. It probably goes back to my journalistic background. So
right.
I have a couple of different bloggers and places that I go to read, both about global poverty in the development sector and also about nonprofit leadership and management. So I try to always read a couple of articles a day and learn something, find an interesting article to share with someone, senior management team, board member, funder. And I find it's just a good way to make connections with people. So the meeting I had this morning with a funder, and I referred to a piece of research, and I'll send that to her. So it's just a kind of way to stay on the radar and have a conversation with someone rather than always being there with your hand out in terms of funders. And I'm also, at the moment, I'm reading Melinda Gates's book, The Moment of Lift, which I'm actually finding very impressive. I didn't know what to expect. And I think she has some very important insights, and it feels very natural. And you wonder, someone like that, did they actually write the book, or did a ghostwriter? So I believe she wrote it. It sounds like her. And I'm inspired by it. And it's obviously she has a really influential voice, and I'm glad to see it on the bestseller list and things, because ultimately that helps create the environment or the climate where people will look favorably at Trickle Up's work, because we're also focused on women.
Right. It's an interesting book. I'm also just in the middle of reading it.
Okay.
So let's think about, one of the things you and I talked about earlier was failure. And I asked you, what do you think about failure? And you talked about managing through adversity. How do you keep people inspired? So how do you think about failure? Because as we know, it's inevitable.
Right. So the first point is, it will happen.
Mm-hmm.
No matter how brilliant you are, you will fail in ways large and small over time. So Acceptance of reality is a very important step. And it's really easy. And I've gotten lost in the fog of failure myself, that you're in the middle and you think, all right, somehow it's going to turn around. A miracle's going to happen. It's going to save me here. So recognition is the first part. Um, um, and this in particular, is, whether it's failure or just challenging times, is where you need your team, your board, your management team, your staff. You know, don't try to solve your way out of the problem yourself. You know, a number of years ago, one particularly difficult challenge here, I guess you'd call it a failure, is we were too optimistic in our planning. It came after a strategic planning period. Inevitably, when you finish a strategic plan, you have a lot of ambitions, a lot of ideas, and we kind of plunged too far, too fast on too many of them. So we were getting ahead of ourselves in terms of spending, and we were looking at a fairly sizable deficit. And I had a very supportive board and executive committee that kind of was patient with me and held my hand. One of them said quite wisely, you know, it's good to have an independent voice to bat things around with, a coach kind of thing, which I had in place anyway, but it kind of helped me see that this person would help me navigate through this. And then we had a luck, actually. We got a very significant bequest that was able to kind of bridge us there financially. We would have made it either way, but it made it less painful. You know, deal with it, draw upon all the inputs and resources and ideas that you can, own your responsibility. You know, there were things in that moment when I look back and said, you know, wow, I should have done this differently. That was stupid. Now, you know, if you spend all your time self-flagellating, then you're not going to be solving the problem. So, you know, I believe, you know, it's important to learn from the past, but I don't wake up every day looking backwards and thinking about coulda, shoulda, woulda, or who can I blame. It's like, I woke up today and these are the cards that are in my hand. I'm going to play them the best I can. And then tomorrow I may have a slightly different set, and I have to just kind of keep moving forward. Because we have a job to do, we have a mission to accomplish, and you do get through it most of the time. So a lot of it is just about resilience and saying to yourself, you will get through this. You know, there was another moment, maybe it was that same moment. We were in a rough patch, and the board members said, you know, you've been around for whatever it was, 35 years. That's actually fairly rare in organizations. This is someone who was a venture capitalist who had seen a lot of businesses. Was very successful in his own right. And he said, don't lose sight of the fact that that is a real asset, that your longevity is an asset.
There's something there also about taking the long view, like you're saying, about knowing you've been around 35 years, knowing you're resilient, your own personal resilience, your organization's resilience, just using that failure that almost, that you guys were having there. Not getting smacked down, but getting up again.
Yeah. The other piece of this has to do with sort of transparency. And I've evolved over time from going much more controlling in terms of control of information to being much more, you know, be open, be transparent, and don't be scared of information. So at times, again, in this rough situation with the staff, or with the organization, sharing that with the staff, not keeping it a secret. And people get behind you because they appreciate the honesty. They're committed to the organization. They're committed to the mission. I'm sure there are moments people like that where people are scared. Am I going to lose my job? Or we're not going to be able to continue whatever my program is. So being more open and more inclusive is a good thing. And also just in today's world and where technology and communications are, it's harder and harder to actually keep things under wraps. So don't try.
And isn't there something about you're being, well, transparent, open, but you're also being, what's the word that I'm looking for? It's right there. Vulnerable. You're like saying, hey, I'm out here on the high wire, right?
Yeah. And you know, when you get down to sort of the fundamental qualities or characteristics or values of leadership, so the notion of trust, and the notion of vulnerability are very important. I think in Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, they talk about that a lot.
Right.
And it is important uh, to be vulnerable, and particularly as a leader, which is certainly, I think, different from an earlier generation where the leader had to be the know-it-all, invincible, the boss can't have a bad day kind of person. I do think you have to be uh, part of your job is to be an optimist and hold people's hand and reassure them we'll get through this, because we have to, because the mission is so important. So you have to find that balance of openness, transparency, realism, and optimism, appropriate optimism, not just blowing smoke.
And I like that you went from more controlling of information to being more, I like that you had your own transition, your own learning about it also.
Yeah.
And that you're telling me and us about that story.
Yeah.
So,
it's one of the issues with nonprofits. Of course, we all want to be out there with our success stories because success stories impress donors, and that's how you raise more money. I'm always impressed with the ones that are open about failures or where things didn't work out. I think there was a website for a while, it may still exist, where people could actually post projects that didn't work out. And I've seen organizations that on their website had a section that said, failure stories or whatever they called it. And I think it would be healthier if more organizations did that.
mm-hmm.
And I can't claim that we're stellar in that regard. And I think at the end of the day, it accrues to your benefit, and even in terms of donors, because of course, they know that things don't work out all the time.
Right.
And so I would think better of someone who says, we started this and it didn't work, and we adapted, we shifted gears, we pivoted, and we made it better. Your job is to problem solve. In our board meeting yesterday, and one of our senior program staff was talking about our work in India, and she laid out very plainly we were having a problem with a particular partner for whatever reason, and so the project was not going well. And then with the partner, we sat down and we acknowledged that and made the necessary design shifts to get it on the right track. And it takes some courage, whether it's with donors or your board, to stand up and say, this did not work out. And sometimes it takes courage to say it didn't work out and we're just stopping because we can't figure out how to make it work.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully most of the time you can say, all right, it didn't work and now we're adapting and we're pivoting.
So that leads me to one of my favorite questions. Besides talking about failure, I also love to talk about what courage has to do with leadership.
Courage.
Because the things you're talking about require courage.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
It's the whole idea of what we're trying to do at organizations like Trickle. It's courage. It's also just chutzpah. We're going to go into some other country, even with a local staff and a culture we don't know, with a limited amount of money when you think about how big India is and what can we accomplish. And the idea that we could actually foster permanent change there that will help large numbers of people. What an audacious idea. Some people would be critical and say you're just intervening and it's a kind of 21st century colonialism. And so there are many people who are critical of what we do, aid, NGOs, and so on. So it's a little bit cheeky to go into somebody else's place and say, let me help you make life better for people. And so I think of that as courage.
And your own courage as a leader. So one is as an organization, and the other is what do leaders, you yourself, need to have?
I don't know. You need the courage to just, every day, whatever the problems are, keep working through it. Raising money. We work and Trickle Up works in places that have high security risks, and I worry about that every day. And so you don't have the luxury of stopping. If you believe in your mission, if you believe that what you do, what your organization does works, that your program is effective, and if you believe you have a moral or ethical responsibility to help people beyond yourself and your immediate family, then how can you stop? You know, I once asked our former vice president of programs, who's been in this field her entire life since graduate school, and I said, if you hadn't worked in the development sector, what else would you have done? And she said, well, what else could I have done? That's the only thing I could have done. And that I didn't get that at first, but the more I thought about it, well, here's her. She has a very clearly defined vision of the stamp, the result, the impact she wants to have in the world in a very single-minded way. So I was very moved and impressed by that. It took me a while to get it.
I like that story. And so if you would go back and either think, which of these two questions do you like? Either what advice would you give to your younger self, or maybe before you became the CEO of Trickle Up, or what advice would you give to, what do you wish that you knew, or what advice would you give to young people that are coming up? So whichever of those appeals to you.
You know, when I came to Trickle Up from the New York Times, went from the for-profit to the nonprofit sector, there was a lot I didn't know. I knew very little about global poverty and international development. And I read a lot, but I wish I had known more somehow. And, you know, a friend of mine who worked in this area for a long time said, well, what you really should do is go to the Peace Corps for a couple of years and learn what poverty is all about. And I said, well, thank you. That's a good idea. But I have children at home and I have a life. And, you know, that's a little harder to do when you're in your 50s. So obviously you have to know your field. You know, I feel I've been very open, worked hard at learning. So now I actually think I'm pretty knowledgeable. And I think also learning about what makes nonprofits tick, some of those things we talked about before, of culture, of decision-making, of participation, of how to find the balance between headquarters and field offices. So yeah, I wish I had known more about that. You know, I'm always learning. Mm-hmm. So, you know, there are things I look back when I started that I said that make me cringe now because they were so impossibly naive. But I guess I had the courage to kind of go and embarrass myself and learn a new trade. So I'll give myself points for that.
It reminds me of learning to speak a new language. Like you can only learn to speak a new language by speaking it. So you have to let everyone know how good or not good you are at that language. And that's what you did. You had to just go start and everybody got to watch.
It's
right?
an interesting analogy because I have never been successful in learning a new language in my entire life. I barely made it through by my bar mitzvah to kind of get enough rudimentary Hebrew. I took several years of Spanish in high school and a year or so in college. And I'm embarrassed to say I don't think I could order dinner by myself in Guatemala when I'm there. So I don't know, my brain isn't wired that way. My wife is very good at languages, but it's an interesting analogy. I do think I've learned this field in a very constructive.
And you had to do it in front of everybody. You couldn't go in your study and practice by yourself and then go, whoo-hoo. You had to go and experiment and see if it worked and adjust.
I can think of several moments, which I won't share here, where I made a complete jackass out of myself.
Yeah. That is courage. And that's being somewhat, you know, some tolerance for failure. Otherwise you couldn't have done this job.
Yeah, but also I think there's an important quality about curiosity, and maybe this is where some of my journalistic background is useful. You've got to be always willing to ask questions. There are no stupid questions except the unasked question. And that means, among other things, being willing to display some ignorance about things, but also a great appetite to learn. And this job, is very much about learning and always asking yourself, okay, what other information do I need? Or, the technique of sort of the 5 whys, if you know this, where you sort of look at a problem and you say, why? And then you answer that, and then why did that happen? And you ask why 5 times, and then you're finally getting to kind of real root causes of things, a much deeper level of understanding. It's actually a management technique that was developed by somebody. I think it's very popular in Japan. So, never losing that ability to learn, that ability to be curious, that ability to ask questions, that ability to expose your vulnerability, even to be embarrassed. And I don't think that ever ends, no matter how many years you've been in your organization or your field or what position. So again, that notion of the omniscient CEO is false and destructive in a way. Because then if you start to bottle up decision making in one person, you're not going to have the best outcome.
And you're not going to be able to scale your organization because you can't one person can't do everything.
You know, earlier in my career, when I worked at Capital Cities ABC, Capital Cities was the company that bought ABC many years ago. And I worked as essentially the chief of staff for the president and chairman of the company. And the president, a man named Dan Burke, who was very wise and a great teacher for me and a great supporter. And they had, 15,000 employees and operations all over the world. And he said, my definition of a perfect day is I don't have to make one decision. Because that means everybody else is making the decisions, doing their job. And whenever I, as the chief executive, make a decision or put my fingerprints on something, people overemphasize the weight of that. It actually has a distorting effect. So he said, that's when I know things are really going well. No one needs me to decide anything. Now, Trickle Up is at a very different scale, but knowing when to be involved and when not to is an art. Some years ago, when I left my job at ABC News, and my close colleague there left me a note that was so brilliant, one of the best pieces of management advice I've ever heard, and simply said, thank you for being there when I needed you and not when I didn't. How perfect is that?
That's perfect.
Yeah, I'm going to have that on a pillow or something, curled on a pillow one day or something.
That's what I was thinking. It should be like a little banner, a little thing you can have on your desk.
It's a great book, right? It's a good book title.
Yeah, that's good. And so speaking of people that we learned from, do you have what have you learned from mentors or other bosses you've had, things that have influenced the way that you lead?
Oh, I've been fortunate. I've worked generally for really good bosses and mentors. Dan Burke, who I mentioned, was a very important one in my life, and he taught me a lot about management. And a man named Tom Murphy was the chairman, and the two of them were really a remarkable team. And both were also highly ethical people. And Tom used to stand up at the annual management retreat in Arizona. He'd have, 500 managers there from TV stations, cable networks, newspapers, magazines. And he would always say, you can make all the mistakes you want at Capital Cities once, except for an ethical mistake. And for that, there are no second chances. We kind of unpack that, okay? So we hold you to high standards. Don't keep making the same mistakes, otherwise you won't be here. But if you screw up in terms of an ethical decision, there's going to be no second chance. And the clarity and the power of that, and I saw them live by those words in a number of cases. People who were awesome. In one case, a very senior executive who did something inappropriate and was let go. They were very important mentors. I've also worked, since I came to Trickle Up, with professional coaches. And that's helpful in the sense of having someone to talk to, someone to listen to. I tend to talk a lot in these sessions. And I realize I just need that because there are, in many ways, being the CEO is a lonely job. There are a lot of things you do want to discuss with your senior team. There are other things that you don't. And after a while, your spouse or your partner gets tired of hearing your complaints every night over dinner. So having an objective third party to listen and to occasionally ask a good question or give advice. So I recommend that to everyone. I'm actually, my current coach is someone who ran a nonprofit or NGO very similar to Trickle Up. He's now retired. We were friends. And when he retired, I said, Chris, would you be, my other coach had moved on from coaching. And so we talk about once a month. This afternoon, we're going to do our monthly call. And it's very helpful. So again, it goes back to this theme of how you make decisions, how you get perspective on what's happening, how you draw in the advice and the insights from other people. at every level, from your staff, from your board, from a third party like a coach. You know, and I think also for people, and you know, I advise younger people is find that mentor, and pay a lot of attention to that. It may be your boss, it may be someone else, maybe a peer or a colleague, especially when you're younger, but learn from them. So it can happen organically, but sometimes you have to make it happen. And it can be at whatever level of formality, you know, whether it's someone who you pay to be your mentor or coach, or someone who simply, let's have lunch once a month and I'll buy lunch. It's important.
And so you're talking about coaching and, you know, having people give you advice or that you can vent to. And I wondered about feedback. So how do you formally ask or informally ask people, how do you know what your impact is? Do you ask for feedback? How do you handle that? Because that's such an important tool to know what's our impact. Are we having the impact that we wanted to have?
Yeah, I don't do that terribly formally. I have an annual review with a committee of 5 or 6 board members, and they get some input from senior staff and other staff and their own observations and my own self-reflection. I don't think that's a kind of full in-depth performance review, although it's useful and the conversation is useful. And sometimes that particular group has helped me see the light on a couple of things where it's been the same group of people for several years. And last October when we were doing it and we were talking about a particular situation, and someone said, you know, we had the same conversation a year ago. When are you going to do something about it?
Yes, that's good.
And that was a moment, and I realized, yes, I was avoiding a difficult decision, and I then made that decision. So that was a good example for me of how performance management is more than just a report card or grading kind of thing. You know, I try to create with the people I work with on a regular basis an open environment, open climate where people can say what's on their mind. I often say, you know, I'm not a mind reader. Tell me what you're thinking. The only way you can insult me would be to insult my children. Other than that, you can say whatever you want in here. I agree. And I point to the picture of my children on the wall. And, you know, but people naturally are cautious around people in authority or their bosses, people who have control and power over their lives. You know, when I have performance conversations with them, annual reviews, periodic reviews, I always try to include the question, let's talk about our relationship. Are you getting what you need from me? A technique that I learned a number of years ago is a simple thing and sort of right. Tell me, and often this is done in sort of a group setting and then people pair up, but all right, tell me 3 things you really admire about me and then 3 things you wish I would do differently. And you have to sort of step up to that and create a certain level of comfort and openness. So it usually works best in a retreat kind of setting where you spend some time together. But it's a pretty good technique, even if it's just sort of a question you add on in a quarterly conversation review. And you want to then make it reciprocal. So it's a kind of safe way to balance positive and negative feedback, critical feedback.
And then if they know it's coming, then they'll have, you know, they'll know. The first time they may be surprised, but the second time they're going to know, and the third time they'll have been prepared. And so I love that. That's a good tool. Yeah. So Bill, we're coming up on the end of our time. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you hoped that we would?
Wow, you got another 5 hours?
We could do a second chapter
Okay.
2.
I'm enjoying this.
I'm glad, because I am too.
The whole question, and this could be a future conversation about the differences between leading and managing a nonprofit and a for-profit organization, I think is a very rich subject for conversation, and also the difference between leading a smaller organization and a very large one is important, and I think important for the the sector. I hope this conversation has value for someone else. And so I think some of these differences, and I think the other thing, what I think about, or, not what I, in the middle of the night is, we're at a very, very weird, complicated moment in the world and in history, right? I'm not talking about the current political situation, all that is bad and weird, but everything is happening so fast and change is so dramatic on so many levels. So how do you, when you think about your organization, how do you think out into the future, where power is managed differently, where technology is making a difference, where cultural and social attitudes, it's just so different. This is, and many other people I know in this sector who have worked it a long time said, they've never seen as much uncertainty, the kind of the pace of change, the desire for the proverbial disruption, the kind of radical solution and incremental solutions. So for all of us as leaders, how do we think about what the world will look like, our sector will look like, and our organization will look like 5 years from now, not 10 or 20 years from now? Because I think in almost every case, it will be very different. And so again, back to that question of how do you get that time to step back? And there's different techniques for scenario planning and future visioning, but I believe that's more urgent now than maybe it's been in certainly in my career here at Trickle Up. And we're in a very good place. We've had a lot of growth. We're having a lot of impact. We have a lot of success. And I don't know what we'll look like in 5 years, but I think it will look fairly different from what it is today. And this is from an organization that has been very consistent, admirably consistent for 40 years. But I think there are big changes in the world, and for us and almost every other organization, how do you take that leap into the future?
So that is such a fascinating question. Is that something that you would, so I'm envisioning like having some kind of roundtable where that different CEOs could discuss that. And I know that a lot of people are thinking, trying to be innovative and think ahead.
Yeah, I think so. I think,
yeah.
The other just point I would make of sort of, again, this theme of getting different inputs. So when I started at Trickle Up and I was brand new in this sector and I had a couple of friends that ran nonprofits, so I got them together and bought them breakfast so I could pick their brains. And that led to the creation of a kind of executive director support group, 10 of us that have been meeting for a dozen years, once a month, variety of missions, but super valuable in terms of some of those higher level issues. And these are the kind of things that it creates space for us to talk about that.
Right.
And so I'm sure, and there's any number of people, everybody likes to talk about the future. It's easy because you can't be wrong. But I think there is value in that.
And it sounds like something that, is it keeping you up at night, or it's maybe not that strong, but it's lurking there for you?
Very much so. It's more top of mind than it was a year or two ago.
Right.
Normally what keeps you awake at night is raising money, personnel issues, very operational things. Those kind of deeper issues don't usually keep you up at night because they're deeper and because they're not immediate in terms of the consequences.
I will add that to my list of questions and see what, let's see what other people think about it. I do know that people are talking about how they're trying to get their organizations to be innovative and break out of the box. Those are my words.
Right.
But I haven't heard anybody express it quite the way that you have. Yeah.
It's also a question, I said something once, I think it was Gene Case. You should be thinking seriously about the next generation of your leaders should be someone who's in their early 40s, not in their mid to late 50s or 60s, which is normally how things go. And you have to make the leap on leadership, and you are simply as a prisoner of your generation limited. And so you need to stretch outside your own demographic. That's a radical idea, because usually you would say, well, that person, they may be great, but they don't have enough experience. But I think there was a lot to that, and you certainly see some of the very impressive younger entrepreneurs in this sector who are doing things
Right.
differently. So finding there's that kind of interesting contrast between youth and experience, and how to find the best of that. But the old notion that you work patiently, you rise up in the organization, and then when you're 50 something, you might get to be the CEO. Maybe that doesn't work anymore, even for established organizations.
And on that note,
Okay.
thank you so much for your time for this great conversation. I took notes about what we could do for a chapter 2. So thanks so much, Bill, for your time and your sharing your thoughts and your wisdom with us.
Thank you, and I hope this is useful to others as this gets out on YouTube or wherever. And the opportunity to kind of share whatever insights and experience that I have matter to me. So I hope I can do some good somewhere.
Thank you.